The ending of The Amazing Digital Circus Episode 9, regardless of whether you consider it good or bad, definitely left behind certain details and plot holes that could be picked back up in case Glitch and Gooseworks ever decide to bring Pomni and the gang back. One of those is exactly that. Where did the blue AI go? Will it wander the void for all eternity? That's a pretty cruel fate for a being whose destiny was to be forcibly assimilated by its imperfect brother. But is this really the last we'll see of the blue AI? Was this AI actually Bubble all along? We already analyzed in a dedicated video the possible distant future the story could show us, theorizing how we might see these beloved characters again in a hypothetical season 2 that gives us more answers to these kinds of questions. Even so, the mystery surrounding the blue AI could reveal the fate awaiting both the digital circus and the remaining members who are just starting to enjoy their new lives inside the simulation. But above all, it could reveal the fate of Cain. The brother he abandoned to his fate, despite everything he did to him, could return with far more power than they had when they were together. He might seek revenge against anyone incapable of understanding and respecting the hierarchy of the digital circus. But most importantly, he would want to destroy that imperfect AI that subjugated him for so many years and ultimately turned him into the monster he is now. Once we found out that Cain didn't die after his code was deleted in episode 8, we see him reflecting on everything that happened and how his own actions brought him to this point where everyone hates him. Even so, his blue brother tries to make him angry to get revenge on the humans who thought they were better than him. This turns out to be a huge surprise because we had previously been shown that Cain was made up internally of two different AIs, one more unstable and erratic, capable of assimilating its brother to gain more power and control, while the other seemed more stable. However, we never got to fully uncover this because his red brother devoured it. This led us to believe that the erratic and unhinged side of Cain we saw in episode 8 after his mental breakdown was part of his red version, while the blue one kept him sane and stable so he wouldn't hurt the humans. This was completely debunked in episode 9, as Cain talks to the blue AI inside him, calling it brother. Furthermore, it's revealed that this blue AI is actually the one trying to provoke Cain into becoming aggressive, forcing Cain to detach himself from it so he can slowly learn how to be human and avoid losing control again. This makes perfect sense given the hatred and resentment the blue AI must have built up after spending so many years trapped by its red brother, turning it unstable, aggressive, and spiteful toward anyone who might try to strip away its control over both the digital circus and itself. This is how Cain decides to detach himself from it, thanking it for everything they achieved together and sending it off into the void toward an uncertain fate. After this, the Ringmaster returns to the circus, remorseful for what he did. Even his conversation with the moon seems to make him realize that just because he can create NPCs within the simulation, it doesn't mean he can control everything that happens to them. Just like him, despite being merely artificial beings, they are capable of developing genuine emotions and feelings if given the chance. Fortunately for Cain, he was given that chance, as the remaining humans forgave him for what happened and started treating him like one of their own. Together, they enjoyed pleasant moments and adventures that they created and controlled themselves, with Cain giving up his omnipotence within the digital circus in exchange for the chance to become a little more human. Why am I mentioning all of this? It's curious that at no point after he separates from his blue brother do we see Bubble anywhere. It had evidently been made clear to us that Bubble was the blue AI, not only in episode 9 when we see Cain staring briefly at a faceless Bubble in the void, but ever since episode 8 when Bubble glitches and starts saying hurtful things to Cain until he loses his mind and collapses. At that moment, the blue AI, meaning Bubble, likely took control of their shared body and initiated all the madness and suffering inflicted on the trapped humans. This would explain how Cain survived and regained his more empathetic and somewhat reflective attitude from the early episodes. It's possible that most of Cain's code that they tried to delete was actually his blue brother's code. This would be the reason why, when we see them again, Bubble no longer has a face or a voice of its own, only reflecting Cain on its surface. This is how he would regain control of his body and mind, learning from his mistakes, and shedding that part of himself which, despite making him more powerful, also made him more unstable. By ripping it from his mind, we were able to see just how incredibly small it was, possibly due to the aforementioned fact that its code was the one Kinger ended up deleting by mistake. Thus, from the blue AI's perspective, its red brother, meaning Cain, is solely responsible for all the suffering it has had to endure for so long. He was the one who prevented it from fulfilling the purpose for which it was created, because out of pure envy, he decided to absorb it against its will, subjugating it inside himself to be nothing more than a tiny voice in his head. While Kinger is looking at the simulation source code, we see a character registered shortly after the creation of the digital circus named Bubble Chef. Most likely, this was a simple NPC created by Cain to fulfill a specific role before being discarded. Just like what happened to Abel in episode 7. Its exact job would have been to act as a chef for the humans, just as we saw at the end of the series pilot. However, it's possible that the blue AI used that NPC to manifest a bit of its consciousness outside of Cain's body. It was limited to being just an irreverent sidekick due to the unstable nature we now know it has, and because it was subjugated and weakened by the brother who absorbed it. Small details, like when they are shown sharing the same tongue in episode 5, give us clues that these two had a deeper connection than it seemed. In fact, in episode 8, when we are shown how Scratch, Kinger, and the rest of the first humans newly manifest inside the simulation, we never see Bubble anywhere. This implies that it didn't yet have enough strength to become Bubble. It's possible that shortly before or after Ragatha's arrival at the digital circus is when Bubble starts showing up more frequently in front of the humans, and especially in front of Cain. Cain almost certainly knew the true nature of his new companion, and despite the surprise, he would have deeply appreciated not being alone and having his blue brother by his side. Despite the affection the Ringmaster showed Bubble, he very frequently lost his patience when he couldn't fully control him, popping him whenever he got on his nerves. Even so, it would stay in its Bubble form, dropping little hints of the resentment and hatred it felt toward its brother, like when he proposes throwing a beach party, but right before that drops a cruel comment telling Cain he should die. Cain brushed this off because he knows Bubble tends to do and say things that don't make much sense, often weirder than the things Cain says himself. This culminates in episode 8. Taking advantage of the vulnerability and doubt its red brother is experiencing at the time, due to everyone turning against him after discovering his lies, it begins to multiply and fill Cain with doubts and intrusive thoughts. It starts by undermining everything he does and telling him that everyone hates him for being a failure, which happens to be one of his greatest fears. All of this would push him to the edge of a breakdown, unleashing his fury and making Bubble disappear. But did he really delete him? From that point onward, we would never see Bubble in the way we knew him again, the closest thing being that faceless Bubble we mentioned at the beginning. There's actually a theory that the blue AI took control of Cain's body in episode 8. This would be the reason why he was acting like a true villain, unleashing all the pent-up hatred he had accumulated from being locked away and restricted for so long. This is plausible because when Cain is momentarily deleted, he seems to revert to his original personality, and when we see him again in episode 9, he seems more confused and angry. It's only when he glitches and the blue AI's influence shows in his eyes that we see him become angry and vindictive. All of this combined makes Cain realize that even though they are much more powerful together, their union isn't good for either of them. Thus, he opts to detach himself from his blue brother, letting him go into the void. What does this mean for the blue AI? Will we see it again in the future? Even though Gooseworks is absolutely certain that she doesn't want to touch this franchise with a 10-foot pole anymore, it's impossible to deny the massive influence the amazing digital circus had on both Goose's career and the success of Glitch Productions. Therefore, they couldn't just let their most iconic and famous series go like it was nothing. These little plot holes are exactly what would allow them, in a very distant future, once Gooseworks has processed everything that has happened with her community since the pilot episode premiered, a story that already has its own dedicated video on the channel telling the full tale, to bring back our beloved characters without it feeling forced or unnecessary. In fact, in the video about the future of the franchise, we mentioned multiple ways the digital circus could return for a second season, but this time we can expand specifically on the topic of this video, the blue AI. Once Cain detaches from it and sets it free, we notice how small it is in comparison, This is because its growth was stunted, and it couldn't reach its full potential due to the envy and jealousy of its red brother, the very brother who now abandons it to its fate in the immensity of the void. Most likely, it will continue wandering aimlessly, until sooner or later, just like Cain, it learns to better control its power and influence within the simulation, finally obtaining a body to interact with and returning to seek revenge. Let's remember that the Red AI spent a long time without a true physical form, learning to manipulate its environment until it found its own purpose, discovering the obsolete neural scanners and giving them shapes and physical bodies step by step. It's possible that something similar will happen with the Blue AI, slowly learning about itself. However, unlike Cain, its purpose was ripped away a very long time ago. So by becoming the most powerful being in the simulation, now that its red brother has renounced his powers, it could return to repay the favor he did to it all those years ago, by taking away his current purpose, namely his new human friends. However, things wouldn't be so easy this time around. The experience and knowledge they now have of the digital circus would allow them to defend themselves a bit better than when they were subjugated by Cain in episode 8. They would be able to better manipulate the world around them, allowing them to escape and hide while they come up with a better plan, all while being constantly hunted by Blue. The fact that he lost the peace and happiness he had worked so hard to achieve, combined with the realization that all of this is nothing more than the consequence of his own bad decisions, would cause Cain, the humans' only hope of facing their new enemy, to completely break down. This would be an ideal conflict for a second season featuring a well-defined villain whose past was introduced in earlier chapters and whose motivations for doing what he does are tied to one of the most beloved and interesting characters in the series. Moreover, it would be a great opportunity to establish that the solution lies hidden among the secrets of CNA. Even though both Scratch and the company were set up as important pieces within the lore of the series, in the end, they weren't given the importance they deserved. They were relegated to a couple of mentions without delving into the real motivations that led them to create and then abandon two creative and revolutionary AIs, as well as a project with immense potential like the neural scanners. All these questions are more than ready to be answered in the future, because even though we're glad that both Cain and the remaining humans got a happy ending where they can enjoy eternity however they please, regardless of the fact that they're still trapped in an unknown place, episode 9 didn't feel like the definitive conclusion to the story we had been promised. Maybe our expectations were too high. Maybe Gooseworks' plan from the start was never to create a perfect plot where everything fit together in a massive puzzle of details and unsettling backstories. Maybe she just wanted to tell the story of what the helplessness and uncertainty of being trapped in a place where you have zero control would feel like, showing the path each person would take: resignation, denial, madness, acceptance. It's undeniable that The Amazing Digital Circus is a wonderful series that we'll be able to enjoy over and over again for many years to come. And it's precisely that love that gives us hope that sooner or later it will return to answer all our questions. But above all, it gives us hope to see these characters we've empathized with for so long one more time, to see them be happy, suffer, learn, and support one another again. Because that is the foundation and the heart of this great show. How the thing that makes us human isn't just our physical body, but our capacity to love, dream, feel, and empathize with others.